made an attempt to garner the worship and adoration and that only God deserves, and God, along with the others who rebelled with him, who I guess pledged their allegiance to him, they were thrown out of heaven to the earth, and then there was some kind of massive cataclysmic event where God then flooded the entire planet, thus wiping out this entire pre-Adamic world in judgment. All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Tattooed Preacher podcast. This is episode 25. 25. I hope you are all doing awesome today. Now, in this episode, we're going to be looking at some things that maybe a lot of you have never heard about, or if you have heard about it, you've kind of just dismissed it as maybe Christian conspiracy theory, maybe things that are fantastical, but you definitely haven't given it some serious thought. And it's a subject that fascinates me. And so we're going to be looking at the topic and subject of the pre-Adamic world, pre-Adamic race. We're going to be looking at what scholars call the Luciferian flood. This idea that the flood that God used in Genesis chapter 6 wasn't the first one. It wasn't the first time that God wiped out the earth with a flood. And so we're going to be looking at the subject of when the devil fell and what may have happened there, which is connected to the Luciferian flood, which is connected to the pre-Adamic world. So that's where we're going to be going today. So that interests you. You're going to want to stick around. I love this kind of stuff. So that's where we're going. But before we get there, I do want to quickly mention that if you haven't yet followed me or subscribed on YouTube, please go to my channel at the Tattooed Preacher. Links will be in the description below. Subscribe to me there. Posting a lot more on YouTube now. So would love to grow that channel, and as well Instagram, TikTok, same handle at the Tattooed Preacher. Go follow me there as well, posting regularly. Well, here we go. Pre-Adamic world, Luciferian flood. When did the devil fall? This is where we're going today. So sit back, relax, enjoy the episode. Okay, so I want to preface where we're going today by saying a couple things right off the top. And the first thing is, this is a subject that fascinates me. And so I mentioned a couple episodes ago that 2024 is going to be looking at a lot of things that I find just super fascinating. And so this subject of, when did the devil fall, and this idea of a pre-Adamic race, a pre-Adamic world, a flood that is not the same flood as the Noahic flood. I mean, all this stuff, I find super fascinating. So, that's the main reason why we're talking about it. Secondly, I want to say that I'm still working through this theologically. So I'm not saying that I fully believe it yet, because as we're going to find out, it's not concrete, right? It's not completely certain. So I'm still working through this stuff. So if I sound like this is where I 100% land theologically, not the case. I think I'm leaning more and more to me believing this stuff, but again, still working through it. Thirdly, this whole subject, this is not salvation critical, meaning if you don't believe this, it has nothing to do with your salvation. This doesn't change the message of the gospel. This doesn't affect your relationship with Jesus. So this is not a salvation critical discussion. And then fourthly, this is not a thus saith the Lord kind of teaching. So there are lots of smart people that love Jesus who do not believe this, who would say that the Bible doesn't talk about this or the text doesn't lead this way. So there's lots of people on both sides who are very smart and who love Jesus that differ in their opinion of this. All right, so I just want to lay those four things out, just to kind of set the stage here. So again, it's not salvation critical. So if you, by the end of this, if you're kind of like, Joel, I just can't go with you, totally cool, but had nothing to do with your salvation, right? So with that being said, here we go. So one of the most intriguing questions that has plagued the minds of Christians for millennia is the question of when did the devil fall, or when was he kicked out of heaven? We all know that at some point, right, there was this great rebellion, and we'll get into this in a little bit. But when exactly was that? And for me personally, man, this question, it has always bothered me and it has always intrigued me. Because it seems like there really is no information about it in the text. And so I've always been like, man, like what happened there? When was it? What was it like? And why was it not recorded in the Bible? I feel like this would be a pretty big thing to include. And I get the Bible is very specific in the things that it mentions. The Bible is not this exhaustive history book detailing and chronicling all the events of the past. God is very specific and had a very specific agenda in what he wanted to be recorded, to be kept, and what he wanted his ultimate word to come out as. And he couldn't include everything. So that's why there's some verses in the Bible that will jump decades between one verse and the next. And so the Bible is not exhaustive. And so, always wondered like, well, why wasn't it recorded? And so this question has always been intriguing to me. And there have been a few theories, right, that have circulated throughout the centuries in Christendom as to when this was. And one of the theories that we're going to focus on today and just spend some time considering is the theory known as the gap theory. And what you find as you take a little journey down this path seems to open up and shine light on some very unusual things about the ancient past that may help us answer some of the questions as to what happened with the devil and those other beings that rebelled with him, that great cosmic rebellion. So, what's the gap theory? Some of you may have heard it before, some of you may haven't. The gap theory is essentially the belief or the theory that there was an ancient creation that existed in the ageless past, and we find it in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And it is here that there's this unknown segment of time. So this is where you get into some people thinking that there the earth was millions and millions of years old. And so this could be far, far back, millions of years ago in the past. And then lots of people think the earth is not that old. So the existence of the earth has been much shorter. So that gap is not that big. But this is where it's theorized that there was another civilization known as the Pre-Adamic world, Pre-Adamic race, before the devil rebelled, before that great cosmic rebellion, that consisted of an untold number of divine beings, along with what seems to be another kind of creation that consists of kings and kingdoms and nations and peoples and cities. And this isn't simply just conjecture or fantasy. Someone just didn't sit back one day and decide to make this all up. There are some biblical texts that speak to this idea that we're going to go through, that kind of paint this picture that may lend to this whole idea of a pre-Adamic world, a pre-Adamic race that's contained in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So let's start this little journey here, going through God's word, just to see what we can discover. And now I also want to preface again that I am not a Hebrew scholar. And when we look at these verses, there are brilliant scholars who look at these texts and who will say that, this is not what the Bible's saying. This is not what the Bible means. But there are also some Hebrew scholars that would read the same texts and say, actually, no, the text can say that. It can mean that. So again, this is one of these issues that is hotly debated. There are brilliant people on both sides, in both camps. And so this is where I'm working through this and haven't made up my mind completely yet on what I think, but I'm leaning more towards the strong possibility that this may actually be true. But again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. So here we go. Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2 says this. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Period. Now, this consists of everything in the physical world and everything in the unseen and spiritual world. The Apostle Paul talks about how he went to the third heaven. And there's other Christian traditions that suggest that there might be more than 3 heavens. I think up to 7 heavens. I think that's what that certain traditions would suggest. But either way, this is talking about everything. So everything physical and everything in the spiritual realm. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's all encompassing. And verse 2 says this, "And the earth was a formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters." So it's interesting here. Couple things I want to point out. One, that already in verse 2, God has already apparently created an earth. So we see an earth present there. And then we also see that we already have the deep, the waters, the chaotic primordial waters. And this is something that we often seem to pass right over and not think about when we're looking at this creation story in Genesis 1. Because typically we think that, God doesn't really create anything until when he says, "Let there be light." But already in verse 2, we seem to have an earth already existing and waters already existing. Now let's go a bit deeper. In Isaiah 45:18, God's word says this. It says, "For this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it as a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no one else. So, as a starting point, again, we see clearly that Genesis 1:1, God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates everything. And then Isaiah 45:18 tells us that he did not create it as a waste place, as a place that's formless or void or a desolate emptiness. He didn't create it that way, but he created it to be inhabited. But in Genesis 1:2, it says that the earth was formless and a desolate, or that it was formless and a desolate emptiness. So obviously, then it begs the question, it begs the thought that if God created the heavens and the earth perfect in verse 1 to be inhabited, but it was not perfect in verse 2, something must have happened between those two verses. So, what happened then? What would take the perfect creation that God made, but then cause it to become a formless and desolate emptiness, a world that is formless and void? And this is where we get the idea now of where the great rebellion in heaven happened, where the devil and his entourage were cast out of the realm of heaven, and as a result, God judged the world, and the result was a planet engulfed in water, a planet that had become formless and a desolate emptiness. So think of the entire planet Earth being completely surrounded by water, engulfed in water. And this is where scholars lend the idea to a Luciferian flood. The first flood, the first time where God judges the entire planet by water. Now, here are some more verses that dig into this even deeper. 2 Peter 3, verses 3 to 6 says this: Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue just as they were from the beginning, creation. So here we see that this is dealing with creation. Genesis 1, this is the context here. Verse 5, For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice by the word of God that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed by being flooded with water. Did you catch that? You see, the common assumption here is that Peter's talking about the flood of Noah. But as we just mentioned, the context here is that of creation. Genesis 1, not Genesis 6 and the flood of Noah. And then also notice that in verse 6 it says the world at that time. And in other translations, that line says this, it says the world that then existed. So the world at that time, or the world that then existed. Now, we know that the flood of Noah happened on this earth in this time. So it's a weird thing for Peter to say, the world that then existed, if he was speaking about the flood of Noah that happened clearly on this planet Earth that we live on right now. Just a weird, it'd be a really weird way to communicate that idea or that truth. So what we may seem to have here is a world that existed before the one that we're on now, or a world that existed, or the way we see the world as it currently is, if that makes sense. a world that God also flooded with water as some kind of judgment, a judgment that resulted in a world that became a desolate emptiness, a world that is formless and void that we see in Genesis 1:2. So not the same world, the same earth the way it is now, but one that existed previously. Jeremiah 4:23-26 says this. It says, I looked at the earth, and behold, it was a formless and desolate emptiness. And to the heavens, and they had no light. So this is the same words that we see in Genesis 1:2. And it's also interesting to note that the words formless and desolate emptiness, or formless and void, depending on your translation, is only found in Genesis 1:2 and here in Jeremiah 4. So the writer of Jeremiah is seeming to be referring back to this Genesis 1:2 time period and speaking about the condition of the earth at that time. There seems to be some kind of literary connection. The only time those words, formless and desolate emptiness, formless and void, are used in the Hebrew as well, is in Genesis 1:2 and here in Jeremiah 4. Then verse 24 says, I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and all the hills jolted back and forth. I looked, and behold, there was no human, and all the birds of the sky had fled. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a wilderness, and all its cities were pulled down before the Lord, before his fierce anger. So what do we see here? There were no humans. Humans weren't created until day 6 of creation. It says that there were no birds. Well, they weren't created until day 5. But then we see that there were cities that the Lord pulled down in anger. Now, if there were no humans, how did the cities get there? Very intriguing question. Because again, it's important to know that man wasn't there until day 6. And the Bible's clear that Adam was the first man, the first human. So whatever there was before, I don't think they were another race of humans that we currently have on this planet, human beings. Now, the Bible doesn't say specifically, but what we do know is that the spirit realm, or the supernatural realm, or the unseen realm, whatever term you want to use there, that realm already existed. We read in Job 38:4-7. Now, this is where God's going at Job here. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you know so much, do you know its dimensions, or how its dimensions were determined, and who did its surveying? So God is talking to Job about creation here. What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? Now check this out. As the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God, angels, shouted for joy. So we can clearly see here that the angels, that the divine beings that make up the unseen realm, they were already here before the creation of the world. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us when the angels were created specifically, but it tells us that they were created at some point before the earth, before this physical terrestrial realm was created. So we have no humans, but we have a civilization perhaps of supernatural entities or angels, and then all that comes with that, because it's not just one type of angel. There's a whole hierarchy of heavenly beings that's complicated. But we have this ancient world, this ancient civilization that the devil lived in before he fell. And so it's interesting to think about is that there was a time when the devil was created in a time where he was good. You see, God didn't create the devil evil. When God created him, he was good. Now, side note here, this is a freebie here for you. The Bible actually doesn't tell us the devil's name. Many people call him Lucifer, but that's just a Latin translation of the Hebrew word Hallel that we see in Isaiah 14:12, which means shining one. So Lucifer is simply a Latin translation of the word shining one that the King James Version of the Bible, it kept in their translation as Lucifer and then assigned to the devil. So it's not his name, but rather was given to him through church tradition and as a result of the KJV translation. It's just, it was in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible. When it was translated over, that word is Lucifer, and then that word was kept in the KJV translation. And then, as we're going to get into, Isaiah 14:12, it does speak about the devil, but that name Lucifer means shining one. It's not like his first name, his traditional first name. Back to what we were talking about here. So there was a time when the devil was created and that he was good. And so here are some descriptions about him that we get in the text. Now, Ezekiel 28, verse 12 to 15 says this. It says, "You had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You're blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you." So we see here that the devil, before he became the devil, before he became the antithesis of everything that is good, he was a guardian cherub that was beautiful beyond description, that he was full of wisdom, that he was blameless, that he was perfect. He hadn't sinned yet. He was covered with these precious stones, and he arguably, as certain scholars speculate, he was the most beautiful divine being that God ever created. He was set apart. He was distinct amongst the others because we see no other reference to another angel, to another divine being, or another created divine being that is described in this way. But then something happened. Something turned inside of him. If we continue reading in Ezekiel, we see that it says you are blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I've cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, you covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was haughty because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I threw you to the ground. I put you before kings, that they may see you. By the multitude of your wrongdoings and the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore, I have brought fire from the midst of you. It has consumed you, and I have turned you to ashes on the earth in the eyes of all who see you. And all who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have become terrified, and you will cease to be forever. So I want to quickly now jump to Isaiah 14, because he picks up on the same kind of things, talking about the fall of the devil. Isaiah 14, verse 12, or starting in verse 12, it says, how you have fallen from heaven, you star of the morning. That's Hallel, the shining one, where we get the word Lucifer, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who defeated the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be brought down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you. They will closely examine you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities, who did not allow his prisoners to go home? All right, so there is a lot going on here in the verses that I just read. That's a lot of scripture, but it highlights and details some of the things surrounding the fall of the devil when he was kicked out of heaven. And so first that we see is that, this covering cherub, this guardian, this throne guardian, was perfect in beauty and splendor. He was full of wisdom. He hung around the literal presence of God around the throne. He became corrupt. And sin and unrighteousness and iniquity was found in him. Why? Because he wanted to be like the Most High. He wanted to be worshiped and praised and honored like God was. And he allowed his external beauty and splendor to corrupt his mind and his heart, thus allowing pride to fill him, which then led him wanting to be on the throne that only belongs to God. So then God casts him out of heaven, throws him out of the midst of the stones of fire on the mountain of God, from surrounding the throne to the earth, to the ground, to Sheol, to the underworld, the realm of the dead. And this is where we begin to get the modern depiction of hell, of the underworld, of demons and spirits and all that. He was thrown down. And then secondly, we see mention of kings and peoples and the concept of trade. So whatever was going on and whatever this world looked like and whatever this pre-Adamic race of beings were, there were kings, there were peoples, there were nations, and there was commerce. There was trade, which the text says that the devil dealt in trade in an unrighteous fashion. So whatever dealings were happening on the earth at that time, it highlights the devil, it picks him out, and then describes him as operating in an unrighteous fashion in whatever that looked like and whatever that meant. And so let's just stop and think for a moment and let this sink in. Because maybe some of you have never heard this or seen this before in the text. That there was a civilization that perhaps then existed where there were kings and there were kingdoms and there were nations and there were peoples and there was trade. There was a world that was heavily influenced by who we know as the devil, who seemed to have been the pinnacle of that world, of that creation. who was the most beautiful, full of wisdom, a guardian cherub who had influence over the entire creation at that time. But then when sin was found in him and he made an attempt to usurp the throne, he made an attempt to garner the worship and adoration and that only God deserves, and God, along with the others who rebelled with him, who I guess pledged their allegiance to him, they were thrown out of heaven to the earth. And then there was some kind of massive cataclysmic event where God then flooded the entire planet, thus wiping out this entire pre-Adamic world in judgment. And this is where lots of scholars and Christians and proponents of this theory begin to debate the age of the earth and to speculate that in this pre-Adamic world, is this where the dinosaurs were perhaps, and where we find, remains of these ancient hominoids that are not human, but they're close and they date back to hundreds of thousands of years. And so you get, Christians on both sides, saying that the earth is millions of years old and the earth is not millions of years old. And you get this whole discussion about the Bible and science and history and dating and trying to make the Bible compatible with science and the science compatible with the Bible. And this is where you get into all of that stuff. And for me, that's not what this particular episode's about. And I won't die on this hill, but I tend to think that the earth is older than younger, just given the kind of things that we've looked at today, and just given a lot of the stuff that I guess that science has discovered and that we see. But again, I won't die on that hill. And if evidence comes out that suggests otherwise, totally cool with that. But the last thing I want to address is if this is the case, right, that there was this pre-Adamic world, then how then do we approach the rest of the creation narrative in Genesis 1? Because there are a lot of scholars who will then take the 6 days of creation and not view them as God's initial act of creation, but a recreation or a restoring or a reordering of things. So what do I mean? Well, in Genesis 1 and 2, as we've already discovered, that the earth already exists, right? The heavens already exist and we already have water. And so typically, again, when we think of the creation narrative, the first act is always, let there be light. But if there is already water on the earth, and we already have, waters and the earth and the heavens, if that's already there, then this let there be light, this light is not actually the first act of creation. Well, in 1 John 1, verse 5, it says that God is light. He's light. So another way to look at Genesis 1:3, where it says, God said, let there be light, you could look at that and say God's making this, definitive statement, basically saying, I'm here. I'm showing up. I'm going to be stepping into this space and removing the darkness, removing that darkness over the chaotic waters that have engulfed the entire planet. I'm showing up. I'm here. I'm about to reveal myself, and I'm about to show up and start reordering things and start rearranging things. Let there be light. I'm here. It's one way to look at it. In Genesis 1, verses 6 to 8, then, it says, then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters that were below the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. So, question, did God create anything here? It doesn't appear so. It says that he only took the waters that were already there and separated them. So nothing was created. He's simply reordering or rearranging things. He's taking the waters that were above and the waters that were below and separating them. He's not actually creating anything. He's rearranging things. Then Genesis 1 verses 9 to 13, it says this. Then God said, let the waters be gathered into one place and let dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So did God create anything here again? It doesn't appear so. It says he took the waters that were already there and he gathered them together now. Then it says that during this gathering process that the dry land appeared. So it seems to be suggesting that the land was already there. It was just covered by water. So God's rearranging things. He's separating the waters above from the waters below. And then he's taking the waters below and he's moving all of them to a certain place, thus causing the land, the dry land, to appear. Then verse 11, God says, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit according to their kind with seed in them. Now, the King James Version says it this way. He says that later, or it says that later, God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. So the seed is already on the earth, and it was so. The earth produced vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit seed with seed in them according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning the third day. So, question, did God create anything here? It doesn't appear so. It appears that the seed was already in the earth. And so God is just bringing up what is all, or what was already there previously. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire 7 days here, but you can see the pattern that God he's reordering things. He's restructuring things. He doesn't seem to be creating them. That already happened in Genesis 1:1. So then that lends to this idea of a pre-Adamic world that existed, a world in which a civilization was present and where the devil fell, thus causing God to judge the world with what scholars call the Luciferian flood, which we see from 2 Peter 3 and Jeremiah 4, a world that became formless and desolate emptiness. So, there was a lot of scripture there. There's a lot of stuff that we covered there. You can even go a lot deeper into this. This is kind of, I would say, a quick overview of this subject. And again, like, I'm still working through this theologically. I see the arguments from both sides, and to me, it just seems like there's a lot of unanswered questions with the way traditional Christianity has approached this subject. Because it's very clear, especially, in Jeremiah 4, in Ezekiel 28, and in Isaiah 14, man, like there were kingdoms and there were people and there were nations. And, those texts are speaking about the devil when he was cast down, because it says the devil in Ezekiel 28, he was in the Garden of Eden at that time. And in the Garden of Eden, it says there were nations and there were kingdoms. So what that creation was, again, that is pure speculation. Was it another kind of humanoid race? We don't know. But again, as I pointed out, the one thing we do know is that there was the angelic realm, the unseen realm already existed before the earth was created. So was it some ancient civilization of divine beings? And in that civilization, the way the hierarchy was structured, maybe there were some that were considered kings, and that there were kingdoms, and there were nations, people. Like, again, I don't know, but I wish the Bible was more specific on this. And you can approach this two ways. Like, these kind of subjects, you can say, well, clearly the Bible is not specifically talking about it, so you know the probability is very low because God didn't care to include it. Or you can look at it like the Bible is not exhaustive, and maybe the ancient readers who the text was originally written to, right? The Bible is written for us, but it wasn't written to us. Maybe the original hearers would have looked at the text and seen these things, and God didn't see fit to go more into detail with them because they already knew it. I don't know. But as we look at this subject, again, I think it's fascinating. I think it makes a strong case that this is perhaps when the devil fell, and kind of how things played out. To me, it makes sense. But again, there are Hebrew scholars, there are brilliant men and women who love Jesus who would look at this and say, no, it's nonsense. The text doesn't say that, and they would have their own interpretations and their own things. But I haven't heard those who are critics of this view. Their arguments, to me, they don't hold as much water to me as this. Now, that may change over time, or if there are more discoveries made, or if there whatever. Like, I'm completely fine with this, of finding out one day that this is all, it was wrong. This is not when it happened. I'm not going to die on this hill, but I think that there is some credence here. I think that it makes sense. And it's just, to me, it's just a fascinating subject to think about and to consider. So that's going to be it for this episode on this topic. I hope it made sense, at least. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the description below. Feel free to email me. This kind of dialogue about this kind of things are things that I love to talk about. So yeah, feel free to hit me up there. And I hope that this maybe encourages you to take a bit of a deeper dive into these things. There's a ton of material out there on this stuff. You just got to find it. But and maybe in future episodes we'll maybe dive in a bit deeper into certain areas, because again, this was a bit of a high level perspective, kind of a quick overview of this. But yeah, so thanks so much for listening and or watching, those of you who made it all the way through. And just want to say thanks to everyone again for all your support, for all your engagement in the content that I produce, whether it's YouTube videos, podcasts, or social media stuff. Really appreciate it. Go follow me, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. And yeah, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Much love. God bless.